sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This year we are celebrating the 250th year celebration of course, this nation, going all the way back to 1776. And so it seemed very appropriate that an individual that I interviewed many years ago, actually 6 years ago when his book came out, Did America Have a Christian Founding?, would be good to bring him back to the microphone. We had him in studio back then, and since then, of course, he has gone on to certainly very significant places to have an influence, including Regent University's Robertson School of Government. He's also the director of religious liberty there. Graduate of Wheaton College, has his PhD in government from the University of Virginia. And as we mentioned just a while back when we had Kelly Shackelford in here, he was invited to actually speak at the first National Religious Liberty Commission that was held. Many of them have been held since then. And so, Mark David Hall, welcome back to Point of View.
Thank you so much for having me, Kerby.
It was great to see you back many years ago. You were at George Fox at the time. The book had just come out. And I might just mention that the reason the book came out was because you had done this very significant speech that took place at the Heritage Foundation that had the title, Did America Have a Christian Founding? And that resulted in, I think, 300,000 downloads and more of the speech. And as a result is the reason that you wrote the book.
No, that's exactly right. And I was shocked to learn that figure, because we're talking about literal downloads as opposed to just clicks, someone who looks at it and goes on. And so those numbers were allowed me to convince Nelson Books that this was a book that would be of interest to a broad audience. Most of my works before that one had been aimed at academic audiences, and I think they're good and useful books, but they never would sell more than 1,000 copies, whereas this one was intended for the general reading public. Anyone who likes to read, anyone interested in these sorts of questions can pick it up, and it's hopefully very accessible.
Quite readable.
Any level of education.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
And I might just mention that we do have a link to your website, markdavidhall.org. You'll see where Glenn Beck and Eric Metaxas and Ben Shapiro, and you go all the way down. Oh, even Kerby Anderson has a comment there as well. But more importantly, when the book first came out, the first few comments came from people like Kelly Shackelford and Daniel Dreisbach and Marvin Olasky, all people we have on the program with some regularity. And I just think it illustrates again that this is an ongoing question, and perhaps even more so here in 2026, don't you think?
I think so, exactly. Yeah, we're obviously celebrating the nation's 250th birthday, and there's two ways we could go. One direction, the 1619 Project, America is a horrible, failed experiment in racism and sexism and militarism and so forth, and I think we would have gone in that direction had we had a Harris presidency. Unfortunately, with the Trump presidency, at least at the national level, to the extent to which the government's involved, we have recognition. America is not a perfect place, but it's a very, very good place. And because of our founding and the principles of our founding, really all Americans, Christians or not, have benefited tremendously. And so I've been very heartened to see the sort of America at 250 celebrations that are being planned, that at least the ones I'm aware of.
Let me just mention we're in this hour going to go through a number of things. We're going to look at a couple of the myths in just a few minutes that are used to argue against that premise of did America have a Christian founding. We're going to focus a fair amount of time, obviously, on the First Amendment, religious liberty. But even before we get to that, in the column that I wrote about your piece years ago, and then I wrote a more recent one here as well, you help us kind of think through this issue of how to think about whether or not you have a Christian founding, in which you have many founders were actually identifying themselves as Christians. Then you have others that I think we can honestly say from their writings, can we agree they were Orthodox Christians? But then you have others that maybe acted like it, and in some way or another certainly agreed with some of the principles that are elicited in not only your book, but in the Declaration and the Constitution, and then others were influenced. And so sometimes when you say, is this a Christian nation, it's confusing because until you define your terms, as you do so accurately, some people can immediately say yes or no without understanding kind of the nuance. Can you help us out with that?
Yeah, so this is what I address in the very first chapter of the book, the introduction. What do we mean by a Christian founding? And I lay out a couple of possibilities, some of which you just mentioned. If we could go back in time and ask the founders, what religion are you? I think it's just almost without debate that every single one of them would have said, I am a Baptist, I am an Anglican, I'm a Congregationalist, I am some stripe of Christians. Even those we know that in their heart of hearts rejected Orthodox Christianity probably would have said something like that. But that's not a very interesting finding, right? They might not have been well-read Christians. They might not have been serious Christians. They might not have been Christians, or they might have been Christians wanting to create a secular commonwealth. And so I then go on to consider, okay, well, are they Orthodox Christians? And there we have every reason to believe that many of them would fit that category. We know a few would not, a handful would not. And they're important founders. So Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, and John Adams were not Orthodox Christians, even though they still would have identified themselves as one. But even that's not so interesting. So just to jump to the conclusion, I ask, were America's founders influenced by Christian ideas, or ideas developed within the Christian tradition of political reflection? And there the answer is an unambiguous yes. I think with beyond a shadow of a doubt, we can argue that America had a Christian founding if we define it in that way. And that's perhaps the most significant way, right? I'd much rather have someone, let's say a James Madison, who is very private about his religious beliefs. I would hesitate to label him. And yet in Federalist 51, just for instance, he said, if men were angels, government wouldn't be necessary, but men aren't angels. And therefore we need government, we need separation of powers, we need checks and balances. And so there I think we see an influence of the Christian idea that humans are sinful and that even Christians struggle with the old man within, and that this conviction led to some very concrete aspects of America's Constitution.
And again, what you find, especially with James Madison, and I'll hold up the booklet that I did a couple of months ago on a biblical view on the Federalist Papers, is that, it had some Calvinist ideas studied under Witherspoon. You can't read at least a few of the Federalist Papers, and I'll point you to Federalist Paper number 10, maybe Federalist Paper number 51, which you just mentioned, which were both written by James Madison, that even if you say, look, I can't read all the Federalist Papers, I bet you could read one or two. And if you do, you're going to say he's pretty much talking like a Christian, where he stood in terms of all the other theological doctrines we can set aside. But in terms of understanding that we have a need for countervailing ambitions, we need for checks and balances because we believe that human beings are not angels, that they have a sin nature. He doesn't use that phrase, but he certainly implies that. I think illustrates at least one of the points. So let's take a break. We're going to come back and look at some of the myths. But as we do so, those of you watching online, I'll hold up some of the other booklets we've put together, a biblical view on one nation under God, a biblical point of view on, of course, the Bill of Rights, a biblical view on the patriot preachers. We're going to get into that a little bit later, even a biblical point of view on constitutional interpretation. These are shorter booklets where you will find, in some cases, quotes from Mark David Hall and other writers about some of these issues, so that if you find yourself maybe having a discussion about did America have a Christian foundation, you'd have some resources you could look at and maybe even investigate. We'll come back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
It has been more than 10 days since the Trump administration successfully removed Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro from power. The criticism of the president was predictable. It was described as reckless and unconstitutional. Critics said that it was a justification for impeachment proceedings. Of course, the critics ignore the precedent set by both Democratic presidents and Republican presidents. President George H.W. Bush removed Panamanian leader Manuel Noriega. President Bill Clinton pursued a war in Bosnia-Serbia that led to the overthrow and trial of Slobodan Milosevic. And President Barack Obama pursued military options to bring down Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi. But now that the military action is in the past, it would be an ideal time to begin a discussion about the role of presidential military action. Article 2 of the Constitution vests executive power in the president, who also serves as commander-in-chief. One of the powers given to Congress in Article 1 is the power to declare war. We need a robust debate and discussion about the balance and relationship between these two branches of government. Congress has only issued declarations of war 5 times. Congress has passed authorizations to use military power 3 times. Every other military action initiated by presidents of both parties was done so without formal declaration. Critics only seem concerned about presidential military actions when the opposite party is in the White House. The American people deserve a debate and discussion about the limits of presidential power, especially since we live in a nuclear age. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Did America have a Christian founding? That is the title of the book we're talking about. It's been out for many years. So, again, if you would like to get a copy of it, let me just mention that we have a link to Mark David Hall's website as well as information about the book, and so that you can get it. I have, of course, a hardback. Now you can get it in Kindle or paperback as well, and I would commend it to you. But, Mark, if we can for just a minute, let's maybe focus on some of the myths. And the first one is, are the founders deists? Now, it's quite clear that there is a short list of those who would accept deism, the idea that God started the universe but backed away and was not involved in the day-to-day activities. My quick answer sometimes, if I get that question when I'm out speaking, is to say, well, if you look at some of the times in which we had the various congresses gathered together, before they would consider anything, they would spend sometimes all day, but certainly all morning in prayer. Those are pretty dedicated deists praying all morning, but you have obviously looked at that and recognized that there are some civic leaders who publicly embrace deism, but then as soon as you do so, the next piece is, well, aren't there any others? Because, you know, it's a short list, isn't it?
It's a very short list. In fact, I would say there are 2 founders that are deists, Ethan Allen and Thomas Paine. And Thomas Paine, of course, is from England and only spends about 20 years of his life in America, so I'm not even sure we should count him as an American. Now, if we go beyond those 2 to a Jefferson, a Franklin, a John Adams, I'm sorry to say they were not Orthodox Christians, but all of them spoke, even with some regularity, about God intervening in human affairs, in the affairs of men and nations. And so by the regular definition that most of us have, they wouldn't be deists. Now, someone like a Thomas Jefferson maybe was just doing that for rhetorical effect, and I'm open to that argument. But even so, it's hard to get to the fingers on one hand if we want to list the civic leaders in the American founding who were deists, almost non-existent.
One of the things that you do is actually give us some quotes, and I'll pick Gordon Wood as one. The Founding Fathers were at most deists. They believed God created the world and left it alone to run. And I think it illustrates the fact that if you're not looking at that from a Christian point of view, you might say, well, that was the prevailing philosophy, Enlightenment deism. And if you haven't taken the time to dig into some of the writings, you would just naturally conclude that. One of the individuals that sometimes gets listed as a deist, you mentioned, is Benjamin Rush. If you've taken any time at all to read Benjamin Rush, you can't even possibly come to that conclusion. And when you start thinking about some of the others who were very much involved in what today we call the Sunday school movement, the Bible movement, they certainly talked about the importance of prayer, God's movement in history. It, I think, illustrates the fact that we all come to history with a set of blinders, with a worldview, and sometimes because you're a Christian, you maybe see some things that other, say, non-Christian historians don't see. Is that fair?
I'd like to think that's the case. George Marsden, the great church historian, spoke about the possibility of having an insider's perspective, where, say, a Christian historian or a Christian student of history might pick up on things that others don't. Let me give you a great example of that. I think it was a great historian, Ed Morgan, who said, in effect, that there's no evidence that George Washington ever read the Bible, much less quoted the Bible. And yet Washington does that all the time. He quotes Micah 4:4 alone more than 40 times. The problem is he doesn't put in the citation. He doesn't put in Micah 4:4.
Right.
And so if you are biblically illiterate, and Ed Morgan was a brilliant man, but he didn't know his Bible well, you could read right over these references to Micah 4:4 and not recognize them as being biblical, and then make that sort of claim in good faith. I think he was acting in good faith, but he was just dead wrong, as my friend Daniel Dreisbach has shown in reading the Bible with the Founding Fathers. Washington, and it wasn't just Micah 4:4, he cites hundreds of scriptures throughout all sorts of writings, public and private, and I think that's important. If he only cited the Bible, if he only quoted or referenced the Bible in major public speeches, one might argue he's just doing it for rhetorical effect. But when he does it in a private letter, in a journal, or that sort of thing, I think it shows, first of all, that he knew the Bible very, very well, and second of all, that he took it seriously and that he quoted it for effect and not just not for rhetorical purposes.
You see that also in terms of the fact, and I can hold up one of our booklets that we've done, and that it relates to the Patriot Preachers, because if you aren't familiar with some of the statements that were made at the time and recognize that some of those statements in the correspondence that went back and forth between the founders and the framers, you wouldn't recognize that those quotes actually came from sermons of the day. And so again, because in some cases they didn't have a Bible verse next to it, there wasn't any need, because a lot of people were familiar with some of those Bible verses. And so as a result, we would even this day quote certain passages of Scripture and not put a footnote next to it, or not even put more than, if we were verbally communicating that, anything, even a Scripture reference, because everybody knows John 3:16 or a variety of other passages. And so in some respects, it's easy to have missed that if you're not looking at some of the history from a Christian point of view. Is that fair?
Oh, I think it's absolutely right. There's a letter I quote from in the book. Ben Franklin, he's going to republish something that was published in America. He's going to republish it in England. And he's explained to the author, or to a correspondent, I think it is, that basically when this was published in America, there was no need to include the biblical citations because everyone would pick up on them. But now that he's publishing it in England, he's going to include the biblical citations so people know what they're reading. And it just goes to what I think my friend Daniel showed in really beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Americans in the founding era knew their Bible inside and out. And I'm not just talking about college-educated Americans. People like Roger Sherman, who never went to college, and many of the other civic leaders who might not have Harvard and Yale degrees. If they knew anything, they knew the Bible, and they knew it very, very well, and they referenced it. They used it in their arguments. They used it in policy debates. So the Bible was the most influential book by far. I'll mention real quickly the study that's been dated, and it could be done far better now, Donald Lutz of the University of Texas, where he goes through basically a representative sample of political writings and finds that the authors of these political writings cite the Bible far more than they cite all Enlightenment authors combined. So you put together Montesquieu, John Locke, Beccaria, Adam Smith, and the Bible is cited far more than all these guys combined. And I think if we were to redo this study today, which we could do far better with I hate to say it, but ChatGPT or something like that, and all the stuff that's been digitized, I think we'd find the Bible was cited actually a far more percentage, because you could get beyond citations and look at actual references without those citations. And when we did do that, I think we'll find the Bible is absolutely the dominant text in the American founding.
One of the books I have on my shelf is by Donald Lutz, The Origins of American Constitutionalism. One of my major professors at Georgetown had worked with them and some other people at the University of Houston, LSU, and other places. And that is, I think, just again, some great documentation for the fact that if you were willing to look at this from maybe a little more objective point of view, or even begin to use your Christian worldview to understand what we are talking about today, this would be, I think, very helpful. We're going to come back and pick off just another one of those myths in just a minute, and that is, does the United States have basically a godless constitution? Because that was an argument being made. My argument, very quickly, but we'll certainly hear from Mark David Hall, is that if you think about this, the Declaration is sort of telling you the why for the American government experience, and the Constitution is telling the how. Now, there's a couple of places where we obviously can see certainly an understanding of theism and God in the Constitution, but the focus there was in some respects to talk about how it should be constructed. And then, of course, if you read the Federalist Papers, which in some respects are the commentary on the Constitution, you would then expect some of those kinds of comments to surface. Just as I sometimes say that if you were today to talk about a church, if you read through maybe the church constitution, you'd say, doesn't even look that Christian. But if you read the doctrinal statement, you would say, well, of course it's Christian. In some respects, the Declaration provides you with a perspective of the why of the American government. The Constitution is the how. And so then you'd say, well, then how would I understand that? Well, that's why we talk about the Federalist Papers, just like having a commentary on your Bible. We'll come back and pick off at least one more of those myths. We've already talked about, were the founders all deist? I think we've answered that one. Does the United States have a godless constitution? And then we want to just spend the rest of our time on, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, the First Amendment. What did the founders believe in terms of this country? And do they actually represent some Christian perspective? So we'll continue our conversation on this book, Did America Have a Christian Founding? Right after these important messages.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, Mark David Hall with us as we talk about his book, Did America Have a Christian Founding? If you'd like to know more about him or the book, we have lots of information on our website. And I thought, David, for a few minutes, we might focus on this issue of the United States. Does it have a godless constitution? 30 years ago, two individuals wrote a book called The Godless Constitution, The Case Against Religious Correctness. You have others, The Myths America Lives By. You have The Free Thinkers, A History of American Secularism. The list goes on, and there has been an argument that as I look through the Constitution, I don't see a lot of evidence of any Christian influence. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, so you're exactly right. And I'll point out the book, Godless Constitution, was written by two Cornell professors. And this is one of the disappointing things. A lot of this literature, some of it's written by angry polemicists who work for the Freedom from Religion Foundation, but some of it's written by professors who should know better, including professors at Christian colleges. And they oftentimes make really bad arguments. So, for instance, when they look at the Declaration, they'll see references to God, to nature's God, to the Creator, to providence, and they'll say, oh, this is just window dressing. These are irrelevant. It doesn't matter. And then we go to the Constitution. They'll say, oh, it's incredibly significant that the deity isn't mentioned at all, except in the date line in the year of our Lord, 1787. And because there are not references to God or Jesus Christ, it's not a Christian document. And I think both of those arguments are just silly. I think the key thing is to look at the ideas underlying the Declaration and the ideas underlying the Constitution. And as I point out in the book, I think you can make excellent arguments that the founders were profoundly motivated by Christian ideas. I already mentioned that the notion that humans are sinful and that even Christians continue to struggle with the old man within, which leads us to limited power, enumerated powers, Article 1, Section 8, checks and balances, and this sort of thing. And that's just one example. I give a couple of other examples. I think one of the most important ones, and I flesh this out in a follow-up volume, Proclaim Liberty Throughout All the Land, is the idea, the conviction that humans are created in the imago Dei, the image of God. And the implications for this are just dramatic. It means we're rational creatures, we're capable of governing ourselves, but most importantly, it means that all humans should be treated with respect and dignity, men and women, Caucasians, African Americans, Native Americans. And if you look throughout American history, you can see that we never arrived at the moment of perfection, but we've been moving in that way in very important ways, right? Getting rid of slavery, getting rid of Jim Crow legislation, and that almost always leading advocates of these moves are Christians drawing on their Christian convictions that I think are very well articulated in the Declaration of Independence, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Think about that. Created equal. That's a theological claim, and it's a theological claim with profound implications for law and public policy.
What about this idea of window dressing? Because in some respects, God was referred to as the divine author or providence. And if you don't necessarily the God of the Old Testament, they then dismiss that. But I think one place you made the argument that using that logic, you could say, well, then the Lord's Prayer is not Christian because it refers to our Father. And so there's a sense in which you have to understand that there are some idioms. I run into people sometimes that say the good Lord, and that's not the way I would say it, not the way you would say it, but that doesn't necessarily mean they don't believe in God. And I think there's a sense in which maybe there is an attempt to actually remove even some of the most religious ideas from the text. And so that's an important issue. But let me just take one other one that you have addressed before. That is, we do have the Constitution saying there should be no religious test for office. Now, again, you and Daniel Dreisbach and others have explained what that was all about. But because we had state churches, sometimes a religious test could be used to prevent a person who is a Christian from being able to serve in office because they're not Anglican, congregational, or congregational, I should say, or Baptist, whatever it might be. And in some respects, our secular friends today are saying that there are no religious tests illustrates that they wanted the Constitution to be secular. But that's not what was intended, was it?
No, I don't think so at all. And yeah, at the time, you do have religious tests in something like 11 of the 13 states. These tests often just required that someone be a theist, occasionally that you had to be a Protestant or a theist who believes in the divine inspiration of the Old and New Testament. But there is a move away from these religious tests, and there are debates over these religious tests, and there are debates that I think ought to be taken seriously. One argument was these religious tests don't work because if I'm a bad man, if I'm an atheist who's bad, I won't hesitate to say, yeah, sure, I believe in God, let me to office, right? So they don't actually keep people, they don't keep bad people out of office, and then they might keep good people out of office. If your test is you have to be an Anglican, there might be, one of the best people in the state to be governor might be a Presbyterian, and you're excluding him from that office, and that's not a good idea. Most broadly, and I would make this argument today, if I'm going to vote in my local congressional election and I have a chance to vote for someone who's Jewish and pro-life and fiscally responsible, and his opponent was someone who calls himself a Christian but is pro-choice and is fiscally irresponsible, I would vote for the candidate who's Jewish in a heartbeat. It wouldn't even be a question in my mind. And so, one could ask, really, how important is it that the candidate, that the elected officials share my religious particularities or convictions? Now, all things being equal, I guess I would prefer to have Orthodox Christians in office to atheists, say. And yet I think one can make very good arguments that religious tests don't get at the sort of outcomes that we as Christians actually want to see with respect to our elected officials.
Well, while we're talking about religion, a good portion of your book is about religious liberty, and you're the director of religious liberty in the states, of course. And this brings us to the booklet I'll hold up now, the one we did on church state, because, again, a lot of our secular friends say, well, no religious test. And really, then when you get to the First Amendment and Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist, which later Justice Hugo Black used to argue that there should be a wall of separation, we today run into people all the time who are actually against religious liberty because they say there should be a separation of church and state. How do you respond?
Yeah, so what I do in the book is I separate the pre-exercise clause from the establishment clause, and I show that by the time we get to the founding, there is a robust conviction that religious liberty must be protected whenever possible, and that religious liberty includes far more than the freedom of belief and worship. It includes our ability to act upon our religious convictions whenever possible. Now, of course, this can't be an unlimited right. If you have someone who sincerely believes that he has to sacrifice a baby to the sun god, we're going to say, no, you don't get to do that, and step in and keep him from doing that. But religious liberty for all Americans must be robustly protected. On the flip side, we have the Establishment Clause. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, clearly applying just to the national government until it was applied later in the 20th century to the states through the 14th Amendment. And here we have, indeed, people from the Freedom from Religion Foundation and ACLU arguing that this clause requires a wall of separation between church and state. And one of the things I do, I hope I do very effectively, is demolish that claim and to argue that, in fact, the Establishment Clause pretty much does what it says, or it was meant to do what it says, that we are not going to have an established church. We are not going to have a Church of the United States, and now by extension, we aren't going to have a Church of Texas or Church of Virginia. But that's pretty much all the Establishment Clause prohibits. And so lots of other things are constitutionally permissible. To take an issue that's bubbling around right now in the courts, can a state like Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana pass a law requiring posters of the Ten Commandments to be on public school classrooms? I think indisputably that it's constitutionally permissible for this sort of law to go into effect. And yet we have our friends or maybe enemies sometimes of the ACLU and so forth saying, no, you can't do that. That violates the Establishment Clause. Well, in no way, shape, or form does it violate the original understanding of the Establishment Clause or the history and tradition of what Americans have done, really, from the early colonies to the present day.
Let me just say we're going to take a break, and when we come back, I do want to mention for just a few minutes your other book, Proclaim Liberty Throughout the Land, because the argument there is that Christianity has advanced freedom and equality for all Americans. And, of course, that is something that is already implied by the book that we've been talking about today, Did America Have a Christian Founding? But in some respects, people say, well, have we benefited from the fact that we've allowed all this religious liberty? liberty, because we've had Kelly Shackelford and many other people from Alliance Defending Freedom or First Liberty Institute saying we now may have more religious freedom and more religious liberty than we've ever had in the modern world. Well, what has been the impact? And that is certainly another book by Mark David Hall. We have a link to his website, markdavidhall.org, if you'd like to know more about some of his books. Of course, we also have this book in case you are interested in reading it yourself, because after all, it's been out for many years, so you're more likely to find it through the links that we provide, both in hardback, paperback, and Kindle. So if you'd like to read that, that is certainly part of what we're talking about in the 250th anniversary of this country. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Professor Mark David Hall with us for a few more minutes, again, as we talk about his book, Did America Have a Christian Founding? Separating Modern Myth from Historical Truth. And in Chapter 4, of course, you have a whole section on the founders believe civic authorities should promote and protect and even encourage religion and morality. But also, I might mention your other book, Proclaim Liberty Throughout the Land, How Christianity Has Advanced freedom and equality for all Americans, because in some respects, Mark, this is the so what question. Sometimes when I've spoken on the booklet that I have, we have a whole presentation on One Nation Under God based on the title of that book. And when I've spoken on other aspects of the Constitution or the Federalist Papers or the Patriot Preachers or Church and State, oftentimes at the end people say, well, that's great. That's what it was maybe in the 18th century, but we're in the 21st century, and most people don't care anymore, and we have all sorts of secular ideas. But really what you are trying to do is help us understand that it isn't just an issue of historical significance. If we really want to promote freedom and equality, and we have something that leads to a tremendous amount of thriving in America, Christianity has been the source of that, and that's why some of the changes that have taken place in the last couple of decades and move us towards greater religious liberty is a net positive for America, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. So one of the objections I oftentimes would get, and it's like the knockout objection. Well, the founders didn't immediately abolish slavery, so therefore we didn't have a Christian founding. And so part of what I do in the second book, the follow-up book, is push back against that and say, well, actually, American Christians were pushing back against slavery early in the 18th century, in some cases before that. By the time you get to the founding era, they are pushing back really hard against slavery. Slavery is abolished or put on the road to extinction in 8 states. Most people forget about that long before the Reconstruction Amendments. You have the Northwest Ordinance that bans the expansion of slavery into the Old Northwest, so that territory that became Ohio and Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, and so forth. And then you have the abolitionist movement of the 19th century. So Christians motivated by their faith to oppose this political evil, this moral evil, and that's a good thing. And then you could keep going with the story into the 20th century. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Ralph Abernathy, Andrew Young, and so forth and so on, Christian leaders being inspired by their faith to oppose Jim Crow legislation. And I highlight these things, but I talk about others. Evangelical opposition to the removal of Native Americans from land they had rights to in Georgia, and so forth. Now, of course, you can always respond, yeah, but some Christians look to the Bible to defend slavery. And I can agree with that, in the same way that today you can point to people who claim to be Christians who point to the Bible or who use the Bible to defend abortion. And I would simply say, yeah, some people claim to be Christians did that sort of thing, but they were wrong. And in fact, the biblical view on slavery, on abortion, is really quite clear if you bother to look. And it's entirely appropriate for Christians to get involved in political activity to oppose these great moral evils. We've done this with great success with respect to slavery and Jim Crow legislation, with some success with respect to abortion, but we need more Christians to enter the political arena to continue fighting this grave moral evil.
Let's also pick up just one thing real quickly that I have talked about before. And the other day I saw a clip where for the first time Glenn Beck says, I did not know this, but the original draft of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence actually had an anti-slavery passage. Now, it was removed because of some of the southern colonies, but I think that's just one of those pieces of history which, if as person as learned as say Glenn Beck or others hadn't heard, it's worth mentioning right now, and just illustrating again that the abolition movement was in full force even in the early and middle parts of the 18th century. By the time we get to Constitution, they tried to do what they could to get rid of that, and in some respects we can wish that maybe they had. But as you point out, if you are looking for the kind of social movements that have made a significant impact in America, almost always they were Bible-based. The abolition movement, the suffrage movement, the temperance movement, the civil rights movement, one after another, those came from Bible-believing Christians. Yes, some people misinterpreted the Bible. I suspect people even to this day are misinterpreting the Bible sometimes, but I think it's an illustration that, if anything, the point you make in your books is that having Christianity has been a very significant positive for this country. And our secular friends, I think, are kidding themselves if they think getting rid of religion is going to make for a more peaceful society. It actually has created just the opposite as we've looked at what has happened to other countries.
I think that's exactly right. One of the things I do early in that book, the follow-up book, is I cite some of these really big books that have come out recently. Rodney Stark, The Victory of Reason,
Yes.
Tom Holland, Dominion, Larry Seidentop, The Invention of the Individual. Now, some of these people are Christians. Some of them aren't. Tom Holland mentions, well, I was kind of raised in Anglican Sunday school, but I'm not a Christian anymore. But then he goes on to demonstrate in spades how Christianity has impacted Western civilization in incredibly positive ways. And so I just kind of follow up on that argument, just focusing on America and to make exactly the point you just made, that if you look at all of the reform movements that we now look back on and say, yeah, that was a really good thing, they were led by Christians. The foot soldiers were Christians. Christians have been intimately involved in almost all the important social and political reform movements throughout American history up to the present day.
Let me just mention before I let you go that because people have probably appreciated what they've heard today, they might be thinking, well, is it possible to have him come and speak to our group, perhaps get some of the resources? We do have a link at your website, markdavidhall.org. You have your books, you have all the endorsements, you have some of the media that you have done and resources. But if people might want to have you come and address some of these issues, would that be a possibility?
Absolutely. I am actually looking forward to doing that in 2026, America's 250th anniversary. I already have a number of speaking events lined up, but I'd love to do more. I love speaking about this stuff. I think it's important. It's important as a matter of history, but you also mentioned the so what question. I think there are important practical reasons why we need to recognize the Christian influence in our history and how this influence might motivate us to be engaged today. Again, to seek the prosperity of all people, the flourishing of all people, Christians and non-Christians alike.
Well, again, you mentioned just a few individuals like Tom Holland and Rodney Stark and others, all of who have been on the program with us. Rodney Stark no longer alive. Tom Holland, I've heard he's reconsidering his rejection of Christianity, so we'll have to see how that all plays out. But it's a good illustration of the fact that a lot of things are coming our direction. And during this 250th anniversary of this country, we wanted to provide people with some resources. And again, I'll hold up some of the booklets that we have on One Nation Under God or Bill of Rights, the Federalist Papers, Church State, Patriot Preachers. This is how you can learn about these issues. This is how you can pass this on to your children and on to your grandchildren. So, Mark David Hall, was great to meet you. It's hard to believe that was 6 years ago in studio. But again, I've certainly been impressed with all the things you've done since then. And I appreciate you joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been my pleasure.
Well, again, the book is entitled, one more time, Did America Have a Christian Founding? We focused most of our time and attention on that, but I might also mention his other book, Proclaim Liberty Throughout the Land. And, of course, he has a number of other books that you can find out about. So go to the website, pointofview.net. If you say, okay, I would like to read that book, it is fairly readable. As a matter of fact, I think anybody could make their way through it and certainly benefit from that. We have information about that on our website at pointofview.net. You can get it in hardcover, paperback, or Kindle, and I think you would certainly benefit from that, and it might help you, especially during this 250th year, learn a little bit more about our nation's founding and where this nation might be headed. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover right after this.
Who can you trust? Years ago, many of us could probably have provided a fairly long list, but today it seems we almost can't trust anyone. Educators don't even know what a woman is anymore. Many so-called public servants have shown all they care about is themselves. The FBI has been accused of bias, law-breaking, betrayal, and journalism. It's largely corrupt, with no Clark Kent standing up for truth, justice, and the American way. All of this is why Point of View Radio is more important than ever, and your part in supporting us is more needed than ever. Do your part today in supporting trustworthy truth. Stand with us and help push back the lies and the darkness. Visit pointofview.net. Don't put it off. Take a moment right now and click on that big blue button that says Donate Now, or Call to Invest at 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Going through the stations and caught Kerby and a very interesting topic. So just listening to it, and so just by hearing the topic, I can relate to some of those topics. But it has impacted my life a lot. I enjoy listening to the station.
I appreciate Point of View. You've been great and wonderful. A lot of information, and I really appreciate all your work you do.
My wife and I have listened to Point of View for about 17 years now. We just want you to know how much you have meant to us in our lives. I've gotten a real education since I've started listening to Point of View.
I want you to think, what would we do? How ignorant would we be if we didn't have Point of View? And come on, guys, give something to Point of View to make sure we don't lose this wonderful voice. And thanks again for what you do.
Thank you, Kerby. I consider this my school time, so my 2 hours of school each day. So thank you very much.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me in the second hour today. And if you would like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. This hour, we've spent some time talking with Dr. Mark David Hall. His book, of course, is Did America Have a Christian Founding? And if you would like to know more, we certainly do encourage you to get a copy of the book. But as you might imagine, I have already written some commentaries based on the book. Did that 6 years ago when he was in studio with us, and did a recent one about 6 months ago when he spoke to the National Religious Liberty Commission. Certainly, he has gotten a lot more national visibility, and anything we can do to help that, we certainly will. So I probably will do some commentaries, maybe even a booklet out of that book as well. So I certainly do recommend that. But if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. But let me also get to some issues. The first article I've posted is by our good friend Cal Thomas. He quotes from C.S. Lewis: "For what you see and hear depends a good deal on where you're standing. It also depends on what sort of person you are." That's C.S. Lewis is The Magician's Nephew. And so the title of his piece is It Depends on Where You Stand. Oh, have we learned how maybe it's a good idea, you think, about not jumping to conclusions even after you have one or two videos, because we've learned quite a bit. As you might imagine, he starts by talking about what's happening in Minneapolis and the ongoing investigation. I put that in quotes because sometimes, again, everybody's free, as somebody put out the other day, everybody's free to mouth off with anything that's said on the internet. Everybody is allowed to have their own opinion, but they're not allowed to have their own facts. And it turns out that we have heard a lot of individuals making some statements about the video from the very tragic shooting of Renee Good, and we now know even more than we knew even a few days ago, even more than we knew yesterday, because, of course, CBS and a number have reported now that Jonathan Ross, he's the individual that fired the gun at Renee Good, has now had internal bleeding. Now, you've had some people say that he wasn't hit. You've had people say he walked out with a hop in his step. Those are direct quotes, by the way. You have had, of course, the argument being made from the mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey, and the Minnesota governor, Tim Walz, blaming ICE and saying this was unnecessary, he was not in danger, on and on. You know the phrases. You've seen the comments. You've seen the clips. We know just a whole lot more than we knew back then. Yesterday, of course, we talked about the anti-ICE group, which is a group that is dedicated to tracking, and this is their phrase, resisting immigration enforcement operations. They do that through apps. They do it through a rapid response hotline. We talked about some of the material that was covered in the New York Post. And if you find yourself saying, well, I didn't get a chance to listen yesterday, which is fine. I know people have a life. They don't have a chance to listen to Point of View every single day. Go to our sections that we have here. First of all, you can do site navigation and go to shows, and you can find the archives there, which is probably the simplest way to do. Or, of course, if you want to just type in something like a Minneapolis or shooting, you can simply go to the bottom of the page, and there's a search engine, so you can find the articles that we made available to you yesterday. Those are resources for you to take advantage of. And, of course, If you have any kind of search engine on the internet, you can search many of them for yourself. So if nothing else, Cal Thomas just helps us understand. When he wrote this actually recently, we have learned some even since he's written this. But okay, let's put on the fact that sometimes, as he says, it depends on where you stand. There's on the one side, you have Tim Walsh, you have Jacob Fry, you have the Minnesota Attorney General, you have all sorts of commentators, you have people on MSNBC, CNN, and all that. On the other side, he points out, you also have, Vice President J.D. Vance, the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, you have the ICE heads. I mean, you got quite a number of individuals, but we've gone from the ICE agent. We first of all didn't know who he was. Now we know his name is Jonathan Ross. His day is over. I mean, his life is over now. Can you imagine what his life is going to be like? Of course, we lament the loss of Renee Good's life. This is something that should not happen, but it did. But also now an individual that did the best job he could. And as we pointed out, there will be and should be an investigation and will be. But all the statements that have been made, will anybody back off and say, well, maybe I overreacted? Because now there's reports that Jonathan Ross, who was at the time, we were having people say he was in no danger, had internal bleeding. So obviously something else takes place. Well, that's just the first couple of paragraphs of the piece by Cal Thomas. Let's go on. Because he then takes us to Portland, Oregon, and that's where, again, an agent had to fire on the gangster group Tren de Aragua because, again, this individual had weaponized their car fleeing a traffic stop. And again, he goes on to some of the statements being made, but I love what he says on the second page of his commentary, and that is, if jumping to conclusions were an Olympic sport, these premature commentators who sought to create a narrative would receive gold medals. The media and Democrats have driven much of this. He says, for the media, it makes for good pictures. For Democrats and liberal groups who may provide them support money, it's a strategy they hope will bring President Trump and his administration down. Not going to happen. But then he goes on to point out there's really two ways to break the law. One is breaking it, the other is by ignoring it, and the latter is mostly what the Biden administration did, letting in violent criminals who committed new crimes, including the murder of American citizens. And again, as he reminds us, investigations take time to sort out the truth. And so, again, the Department of Homeland Security claims that ICE and other law enforcement agents are in more danger than in any time in recent memory. They're cursed at in vile ways. Bottles and bricks are thrown at them. Demonstrators demand that they remove face masks so they can be identified and doxxed. And he concludes by just reminding us of something I need to remind our younger audience of. He says, growing up in the Washington, D.C. area, I was taught to respect and obey police officers because they were there to keep order and apply the law. Then there was only one officer on the steps of the House and Senate. There were no medical detectors and no identification required. He says, now if you seek to enter the Capitol building today, there are stone and metal barricades blocking vehicles from getting close, X-ray machines to examine what's in your pocket as you set foot, and security cameras everywhere. So again, what has changed? Human nature is still very much the same, but he points to social media, he points to the media in general, he points to university professors that have ratcheted up some of the criticism of this country, and we are now, in a sense, paying the price because of some of it. So, first article by our good friend Cal Thomas, just a reminder of what used to be, what isn't now, and maybe a little more wisdom of be careful what you say before all the facts are in. We've learned a lot more in this last week or so. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
It has been more than 10 days since the Trump administration successfully removed Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro from power. The criticism of the president was predictable. It was described as reckless and unconstitutional. Critics said that it was a justification for impeachment proceedings. Of course, the critics ignore the precedent set by both Democratic presidents and Republican presidents. President George H.W. Bush removed Panamanian leader Manuel Noriega. President Bill Clinton pursued a war in Bosnia-Serbia that led to the overthrow and trial of Slobodan Milosevic. And President Barack Obama pursued military options to bring down Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi. But now that the military action is in the past, it would be an ideal time to begin a discussion about the role of presidential military action. Article 2 of the Constitution vests executive power in the president, who also serves as commander-in-chief. One of the powers given to Congress in Article 1 is the power to declare war. We need a robust debate and discussion about the balance and relationship between these two branches of government. Congress has only issued declarations of war 5 times. Congress has passed authorizations to use military power 3 times. Every other military action initiated by presidents of both parties was done so without formal declaration. Critics only seem concerned about presidential military actions when the opposite party is in the White House. The American people deserve a debate and discussion about the limits of presidential power, especially since we live in a nuclear age. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again this weekend, just for a few more minutes, stay on this issue, only because the second article is by Noah Rothman, and I've quoted him before. He's actually been a radio host, a podcaster. He writes for a number of different organizations, I think Commentary, National Review, and others, and he was on CNN's News Night with Abby Phillips, and there was sort of a counterpoint between him and a Democratic strategist, Julie Roginski. But I think it is, again, a reminder that there are some statements being made that shouldn't, and that is, should you refer to this as a murder, an execution, an assassination? No. Can we say that when you are thinking you're going to be hit by a car, the best reaction is to pull your service revolver? I think almost everybody says no as well. We'll leave the investigation for that. But the piece that I wanted to highlight is just a reminder on how something which is so tragic, nevertheless, is used to produce a larger narrative. Matter of fact, there's another piece coming out about whether or not the wife of course, the individual who was shot said drive or not. And, of course, that's kind of hands up, don't shoot kind of mindset. Sometimes people say things which the video shows never really took place. But in the back and forth, there was an argument that I think was wisely made by Noah Rothman, and that is, Julie Roginski, you can't keep coming up with a statement, this could happen to anyone. No, it can't. And I think there is a sense in which there is an attempt oftentimes when any of these tragedies take place, whether in this case it has to do with ICE or whether in the past it had to do with race relations, it could happen to anyone. No, not anyone. It's not somebody just stumbled into this and then got shot. And so, again, let me just quote from Noah Rothman for a minute, and then we'll make some comments. He said, not only was Good's death a tragedy, an uncontroversial supposition, the statement being made by Julie Rosinski stipulated that it was an act of malice to murder and is something that could happen to any of us is not true. And this, I think sometimes it's should be intuitively obvious that it's not true. First of all, it's not a murder, it's not an execution, it's not an assassination. Second of all, it could not happen to anyone because most Americans are never going to go out of their way to impede an investigation or even an arrest by an ICE officer. And this is exactly what we are talking about. But again, part of the issue had to do with the fact that you always hear on especially CNN's Newsnight that this is far beyond what Americans voted for. And Noah Rothman takes that on. He says a plurality of Americans voted for Donald Trump in 2024, knowing full well that he planned to implement what he said would amount to the largest deportation initiative in U.S. history. You remember the number of times the president said that? I know he engaged sometimes in hyperbole, but that's what he said. Anybody saying, well, I didn't know he was going to deport people, really was not listening and now is somehow pretending not to have understood what this particular vote meant. Now, as he says, here's the very key argument. The agent involved, Jonathan Ross, should be facing an internal investigation, and the Trump administration officials who prejudged the circumstances of the shooting, potentially prejudging the investigation, have done the public discourse a disservice. So he takes on not only, of course, some of the ones we took on just a minute ago in Minneapolis and Minnesota, but also the Trump administration as well. He says, as I said last night in this country, we do not adjudicate situations like this in the court of public opinion on the basis of fragmentary evidence. 2 cheers, maybe even 3 cheers for Noah Rothman in that regard. Now, he also says, let's recognize this argument that it could happen to anyone. This would, first of all, not happen if, as we just talked a minute ago from Cal Thomas's piece, we didn't have an influx of millions of illegal migrants into this country during the previous 4 years. A condition, he says, that convinced millions of Americans that mass deportations were the only proper remedy. In addition, the network of activists who egg on anti-ICE protesters to put themselves in positions of peril deserves far more censure than they've so far received. Where are the voices, the common voices saying this needs to stop? We've tried to explain that. Some have. In some cases, both sides have ratcheted up the rhetoric, and that's not helpful either. He goes on to remind us that the apparatus trains, supports, and cajoles, that's his word, activists to confront federal law enforcement with the explicit aim of preventing them from carrying out their directives. It's not a good idea to put yourself, your compatriots, or even your loved ones between an armed officer of the law and the target of arrest. Probably not a good idea to put yourself in front of a car. Got that. Okay. These investigations will take place. But if nothing else, as he says at the end, I do not believe that Americans looked at this tragedy and universally concluded that this could be them. Good did not deserve to lose her life, but neither did she suddenly find herself in a dangerous situation owing entirely to happenstance. She made choices I wouldn't make, which I would advise against. Preferably, progressives would do the same. Good piece. 3 pages. Kind of a summary of the back and forth, and I do appreciate him and others that sometimes go on CNN's Newsnight to just try to bring some common sense to the rhetoric that just seems to get out of hand, and that is certainly the case. So I wanted you to be able to read that piece along with a very good piece by Cal Thomas. But before we take a break, I thought for just a minute I would mention something that is now putting some pieces together. For the last couple of days, I've been carrying around a piece which talks about what happened when the military landed in Venezuela and how many of the Venezuelan security were immediately throwing up, convulsing. Some were bleeding from their eyes, and the argument which was made at the time is that they were using these pulsed radio waves to pretty much incapacitate some of the individuals in Venezuela. We now know a little bit more. This last week, I had a chance to talk to a person that used to be with the CIA. He says used to be. I know what he's doing now. I suspect he still may be connected, but we'll leave it at that. And he was saying, we now know what all those flights were. Those were growlers going in there, and they were determining where the air defenses were in Venezuela. But they were, in addition, trying to avoid those various air defenses put in by the Chinese and maybe even by the Russians. But we also know when they landed on the ground, they didn't have as much problem with the individuals that were protecting Nicolas Maduro. Again, think about this. We had, I think, was it 2 individuals on the American military were shot, and neither, of course, were killed. We have 35, as best I can count, Cuban protectors that were killed, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that we now believe that they had these pulsed radio waves that incapacitated the soldiers. Okay, that provides a connection to something that we have seen but haven't talked about a great deal, which is known as the Havana Syndrome. What do I mean by that? In Havana, it's, of course, in Havana, Cuba. There are individuals with the United States military, well, United States Diplomatic Corps, I should say, that have had all sorts of strange diseases, and they've been incapacitated. And now there's all sorts of evidence to suggest that maybe these radio waves have been pulsed through embassies and a variety of other things. And so what afflicted the Venezuelan troops may be afflicting also the American Diplomatic Corps. And even the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, dismissed the idea that all these noises that they were hearing was overactive cicadas or defective air conditioning units. And I think now we have a connection. By the way, if you'd like to read more, Jim Garrity wrote about that. I think it's still up today, but it was up there yesterday, of the connection between what happened in Venezuela and the Havana Syndrome. So this piece of paper I was carrying around talking about all the things that happened to the Venezuelan troops maybe have also been affecting some of our diplomats in, for example, Havana, Cuba, and perhaps other places around the world. So anyway, just a little bit of a connection that maybe you had not seen before. When we come back, I do want to spend just a few minutes talking about the action item. If you haven't taken responsibility and maybe taken the time to fill that out. When we come back, I'm going to go into it just a little bit more detail so that you know why we're encouraging you to contact your members of Congress. We'll be right back.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let me just mention for a few minutes that we do have an action item. I've mentioned it the last couple of days, but I thought I'd mention it one more time, and this is the attempt to repeal the FACE Act. FACE Act is something called the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances. It was signed into law in 1994 by President Bill Clinton. Prohibits physical force or even threats of force to injure or affect anyone seeking an abortion. First of all, it's becoming a little less significant because there aren't as many abortions in abortion clinics. Chemical abortion has taken over. But more importantly, as everybody warned at the time, it has been abused. It has been used primarily against even individuals that were there peacefully, pro-life protests. It has resulted in sometimes under the Biden administration, police officers showing up at the door of a pro-life protester and incarcerating them. It has been misused and abused time and time again. And so one of the things we are encouraging you to do is to contact your member of Congress and ask him or her to actually sign on the FACE Act Repeal Act, the FACE Act Repeal Act of 2005. And it is something that we encourage you to do. We have, as I mentioned before, a suggested message. So you can already take that letter, click on it and send it, or you can modify it however you'd like to do so. There is a button there for you to hit send, or you can print it and then mail it, or you can even review it after you've made some changes. So we've made it very easy for you to contact your member of Congress. We have on many occasions talked about how that has been used and misused, and it's certainly something that needs to be addressed. So there you go. It is very easy. I've had many people tell me, I'll be honest, I never have I ever contacted a member of Congress. Writing letters to your member of Congress, those sort of went out years ago. Well, now I find myself being able to go to your website, click down the bottom there. It's in the middle one, says take action. I can fill it out and make a comment and send it off. Oftentimes I get a letter back from a member of Congress, and I've been able to do my civic duty. So that's what we are making available to you today in terms of this particular piece of legislation. Let's come back to a few more. I suspect over the next couple weeks, we're going to be spending a fair amount of time talking about the Federal Reserve. Might just mention that the November issue of Outlook has an article by me on the Federal Reserve, some of its history, and one of the reasons why there is such a controversy surrounding it. If you're not familiar, the Federal Reserve is not federal, though that was a deliberate attempt to confuse a lot of Americans. And so it's not federal, and it has, as we jokingly say, doubtful reserves, but it's called the Federal Reserve, but it's the central bank of the United States. Just as we have a central bank in other countries, we have a central bank here called the Federal Reserve. Well, if you've been paying attention, you can recognize that there has been a lot of tension between the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell. Well, this piece by Larry Kudlow, I thought we would post, if for no other reason than Larry Kudlow has been a supporter of Donald Trump, and yet has said Jerome Powell is maybe a bad, he says terrible Fed chair, but he's not a criminal. And there has been a lot of back and forth about the criminal charges being brought against the Fed chair in terms of the amount of money that's been spent, and I think you could obviously argue now misspent, about the renovations of the Federal Reserve. I'll give you my bias. I don't think we should have a Federal Reserve, but that's a story for another day. But Larry Kudlow puts it this way: don't martyr Jerome Powell. He was a terrible Fed chair, but he's not a criminal. Over his tenure, he's consistently missed the Fed's inflation targets with the worst price hikes in 40 years. He was the most political Fed chairman in history, in memory. He talks about raising rates to stop President Trump's tax cut boom back in the first term, lowering rates to reelect Vice President Harris and the Democrats in the last election, he says totally political. You may or not always agree with what he said, but that's his perspective at least. He says, but I think he's been terrible, but he's not a criminal. And Donald Trump would be wise if he would back off from this, he's saying, because he's not going to be able to get his new chairman through the Senate until he withdraws the criminal indictment against Jerome Powell. And if the Trump administration doesn't understand that, it's maybe time to begin to think about that. He also goes on to say, look, Republican banking chairmen, senators like Tom Tillis and others won't confirm a new Fed chairman until these subpoenas are quashed. He does, that is, Larry Kudlow holds out to the possibility this may have been done by the Justice Department. But again, even if this was done by those, the president can say, back off. So it's an exercise, he says, in futility. Yet all this screaming and yelling about ending Fed independence is totally overbaked. Then he reminds us of some of the numbers that we'll probably get back into tomorrow, because we're going to get back into this issue of affordability, some of the things the president's trying to do to actually increase the likelihood that Republicans would retain control of the House. But he does point out some facts that certainly deserve some attention. The S&P, for example, and the Dow have hit all-time highs. Nobody seems really to be caring about that story. Here's what they care about. The economy is growing at 5% or better. Maybe it's going to hit 6 or 7%. I'm not so sure, but, he's believing that these tax cuts might do that. Of course, the deregulation that has led to everything from baby drill, to a deregulation of some of the federal government, that's the case. And he points out that last year, 2.4 million household jobs were created. That's been unreported by the press. But again, 2.4 million household jobs. We saw increase in the number of jobs during the Biden administration, but as we wanted to try to point out, many of those jobs were in the government. There's one thing to create jobs in the private sector. It's quite another to spend more money to create jobs in the public sector. And these are, again, household jobs. This is helpful. And, of course, take-home pay adjusted for inflation has been rising for the first time in years. And, of course, you have record corporate profits. So, anyway, here's an individual who looks at economic issues all the time. He is certainly supportive of many of the things Donald Trump has done, but he's not supportive of this. And, of course, we did post a piece yesterday by an individual, David Bonson, who was critical of a couple of things the president is trying to do to maybe make things more affordable, but might be helpful in the short run to win the 2026 election, probably bad in the long run, which we'll get to later. I thought I'd wind down the rest of this segment and the next segment with a very good piece by Stephen Sokop. It's entitled Myths, Narratives, and the Death of Renee Good. And he is really pointing out how, in some respects, there is this media narrative, or what is oftentimes referred to in the past as a myth. Myths have now become narratives. They're almost identical. But he says, first of all, I don't mean to sound like a conspiracy nut, and he's not, but we're being manipulated. By we, I mean all of us, you, me, anybody who is exposed to any media at all, but especially social media. He says not being lied to exactly, but we're being force-fed a version of the truth that is intended to control our emotions, influence our reactions, and direct our behavior. Now, I'll just introduce this, and then after the break, we'll get into it in more detail. He talks about a little more than a century ago, a French engineer and a leftist radical, George Sorel, wrote extensively about the most effective ways to motivate large groups of people and commit them to a particular cause. And he's talking about committing them to a socialist leftist cause, okay? And the argument is that there might be a general strike, this idea of a strike bringing down industrial production and leading to, of course, a socialist revolution, eventually a communist revolution. It was Sorel that actually believed that what mattered was just the idea of a strike. the perception that something like that might happen, and he referred to this as the glorious myth of the general strike, a manipulation of observation and assessment that would be both powerful enough to frighten the capitalists and create workers to be willing to fight and die for a cause. So when we come back, I want to take that concept and see how that was so effective during the Civil Rights Movement, which is a great lead-in to my commentary that's coming out on Monday on Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter to a Birmingham jail, and how that was so effective in advancing the Civil Rights Movement, but how it's being used today to advance the argument against ICE and the idea of deportation. I'll try to explain that right after these important messages.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let's, if we can, get back to this article, Myths, Narratives, and the Death of Renee Good. And first of all, let's forget what has happened over the last couple of weeks and go back to the Civil Rights Movement, because he says, today we no longer talk about myths, we talk about narratives, which are essentially the same thing. And the point he makes is that during the Civil Rights Movement, you saw it happening on both sides, this idea of how you change the perception. For the people that were uninvolved in the civil rights movement, he points out that during the civil rights movement, you had a fairly significant number of very good people, decent, not really racist, white Southerners, who remained unengaged in the civil rights movement. Why? Because the narrative for them, which came in many cases from the white press, was, well, the NAACP is breaking the law. They're performing illegal acts. And so as a result, instead of looking at why they were protesting, the focus was for them, well, I don't need to find any common cause with them because they're breaking the law. Now, if you were looking past that, I grew up in a community where both my next door neighbor went to Selma when they were marching. One of my Sunday school class members later went there and of course I grew up in California, but nevertheless, the civil rights movement worked on both levels. The reaction and the resistance to the civil rights movement came there, but also that worked for the civil rights movement because, as he points out a little bit later in this article, the advocates of the civil rights movement were hardly passive observers of their fates. They, too, worked hard and long to craft the right version of the world that they needed to see. A little bit later, if I'd written his article, I would have taken what he puts in his second to last paragraph right about here, because in about the second to last paragraph, he talks about Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail and talks about how that served as a powerful testimony to the righteousness of the civil rights cause. And it was for a couple of reasons. Number one, he says, because it was a letter that is eloquently and engagingly written. And number two, because it was written from the Birmingham jail. And he talks about that later on because he's contrasting that now to what we have going on in terms of the tax and the resistance to ICE and how that is, I think, the issue there as well. And so he says the difference is significant because the civil rights movement and the civil rights advocates were arguing in the right. The laws against they were protesting were morally corrupt. So thus it was easy in some respects for them to build some momentum because they were arguing against corrupt kinds of laws, illegal laws, the argument that, of course, is made in the letter from the Birmingham jail by Martin Luther King Jr. But in this particular case, by contrast, he says the anti-ICE and pro-immigration protesters have no such moral clarity. They are abhorring laws that have been passed by Congress, the House, the Senate, signed by presidents, by principles that have been used under the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, the Biden administration, and now again by the Trump administration. And as a result, they do so because they oppose Donald Trump, because they oppose Republicans, not so much that. And if they did think that these laws were morally unjust, there is a procedure, a very effective procedure by which to change those laws. First, through the legislators and all sorts of legislation. Second, through the courts. And, of course, if they were able to actually do this in a morally upstanding way, then the ICE agents wouldn't need to mask their faces. They wouldn't have to get rough with some of these Tren de Aragua suspects, as they had to do back in the days during the Biden administration and the Obama administration. He also says there was another very significant difference between the civil rights movement and this resistance resistance today, and that is the fact that there is a psychological motivation that animates these angry and sometimes violent individuals, and it comes from those who want to speak angry words but then let someone else do their dirty work. And that brings us to one of the phrases he uses in here, LARPing. Now, young people know what LARPing is, but some of my older audience are going to say, I don't know what LARPing is. LARPing stands for live action role playing, which has to do with video games. But LARPing has also been used to have people pretending to be something they're not. And the point he's making here is the Minnesota governor, Tim Walz, sees himself, as he says, as the head of the executive branch of the state government, but more so as the noble statesman saving the poor, oppressed masses from the clutches of oppression. But yet he has been taken advantage of, as we now know, by almost every fraudster, fly-by-nighter, and a number of other individuals. We now recognize all of the problems that have happened in Minnesota. He then goes on and talks about the Minneapolis mayor, Jacob Frey. But the point is that they can speak with angry words, but then, to use his phrase, they're perfectly happy to let others do their dirty work and pay the price for their resistance LARPing. And by the way, he says Renee Good did the other day. She paid the price for other people's LARPing. She put herself in a bad situation, no doubt, but she also made her terrible decisions. But she was manipulated by what? The narratives or the myths. And as a result, sometimes these narratives by cowardly leaders who speak tough words, but they're really not as tough as they make out to be. And so again, this helps us understand myths, narratives, and a word we hardly ever use around here, LARPing, live action role playing. And I think it's a very good piece to help us understand there is a fundamental difference when civil disobedience took place in the 1960s over the civil rights movement against corrupt laws and the kind of civil disobedience and resistance and some of the LARPing that is taking place today. Very good piece. It's just, again, another way to think about some of the things that are unfolding right before our very eyes. Well, tomorrow we're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about a number of different issues. Josh Lewis will be with us. We'll talk about Ben Sass and the path not taken. And then we're going to be talking about this docudrama, Amazing Grace. Maybe you've seen the film Amazing Grace. Maybe you've read the piece by Eric Metaxas, the book that talks about Amazing Grace. But this is a new documentary that might be of great interest to you as well. And then we'll get back into some of the other issues in the news along the way. 2 interviews, lots of opportunity to look at those topics. And of course, on Friday, we'll come back to some very important issues, not the least of which is some of the oral arguments yesterday on whether or not men should be allowed to compete in women's sports. So we'll have a lot to cover this week, but we are out of time today. Once again, let me thank Megan for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. If you'd like to know a little bit more about the things we've covered today, visit the website, pointofview.net, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Have you ever met a child you knew would do great things? They displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, and a zest for learning. Now imagine someone takes that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, they feed them nothing but lies. You know, that scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from the mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.